So people in therapy will sometimes make progress by saying, I notice that I'm catastrophizing again. I notice I'm jumping to conclusions about what other people are thinking again. So simply being able to label their thinking errors is kind of the first small step in being able to step out of them, to snap out of the trance, basically.
Okay. So before we continue, we're rolling. Would you like to tell people who you are?
They don't need to know that.
They don't need to know. Your name is Donald Robertson, maybe one of the world authorities on Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoicism and the link between those two. If somebody Googles Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy, you're going to be the first person to come out. And we're lucky enough to have you living in Montreal.
It's a niche area. Like, I'm definitely Montreal's leading expert on Stoicism and CBT.
Maybe I would say in the world, yeah.
Maybe.
CBT, yeah. So maybe just like a few words about who you are, how did you get to this, why is this so important, and why is Stoicism so popular right now? And I think people are actually using Stoicism as a model of self-help or therapy.
So I've heard.
Yeah, I did. So
yeah.
So I had a really bad breakup about 2 years ago, and I've been listening to all these self-help coaches. And after about a year, I read this book, Meditation by Marcus Aurelius, and I realized that a lot of what I've been hearing around can be summarized as Stoicism. And that's how I fell into it. And I guess this is like a classic type scenario, right? Yeah, so
I call that the deja vu factor in a way, that people are like, this kind of seems familiar, this Stoicism stuff.
exactly.
Like it's stuff that I was already thinking about at some level. People get a kind of validation in a way from reading Stoicism. They think, I always wondered if maybe, like we should be thinking a bit along those lines. It's like it's a perennial philosophy. It's almost archetypal. It's implicit in us. It's rediscovered throughout the ages. And then when people read the meditations, they're like, this kind of makes sense. It resonates with me. I'd started to think along these lines to some extent.
So how did you get into it? So originally you're a psychotherapist. Was specialized in CBT?
Kind of. I would say originally I studied philosophy, and then I went to an interdisciplinary centre where I did my master's degree in philosophy and psychotherapy. So I was always a kind of interdisciplinary guy, a weird cat. It's kind of like jazz or something, like I'm combining things. It makes me a little bit different from other authors. And then I became a psychotherapist, but I was drawing on philosophy. I'd always been interested in the relationship between philosophy and psychotherapy, but I backed the wrong horse originally. I thought the way to go was psychoanalysis and existentialism. I felt like that was going to be the big thing, and that was going to make sense for me when I was 19 or 20 or something like that, right? So I was deep into Heidegger and into Freud and Jung and all that stuff for a while. Yeah, Sartre. And then it just didn't work out for me,
Why? Is it pessimistic? Is that one?
I thought it was overly abstract and kind of ambiguous and overly intellectual. I was looking for something that was more like a Western yoga, something that was a bit more down to earth and practical. I thought existentialism was great, but it was very wordy. It's kind of ruminative. It just didn't seem as practical as, for example, Buddhism. And, when you're at university, doing philosophy, one of the few major schools of philosophy that you don't normally study is Stoicism. And, it's the stone that the builders discarded, kind of became the cornerstone. I used to ask people why academic philosophers don't care about Stoicism.
It wasn't fashionable for a long time.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, they said to me, and I'm not kidding, this is the answer that I got, right? So my friends would say, well, the Stoics really just take ideas from Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and other philosophers, and all they do is kind of figure out the practical application of those ideas to daily life. Well, why would anybody want to study that? And I thought, but that's exactly what people do want to learn about, right? Is the practical application.
Yeah, to make it practical.
Yeah, but I'm not kidding. That's what academic philosophers would usually say. Who cares about the practical application of philosophy? We're more interested in how the theories and concepts originated. So they saw, in a weird sort of way, they kind of discounted the Stoics almost like implicitly for being psychotherapists, for for applying this stuff in practice.
So when did the wind change?
When the wind changed was, well, that's a long story, but I think it started to change in the 1950s, like, because with the beginnings of CBT, but it took a long time for CBT to really get traction in the mainstream. So you can actually look at data online. So, hey kids, I'm not just making this stuff up. You can Google it, right? So you can see graphs that will show you that Stoicism rises in popularity, searches and references and Google books increase around about the 1980s, early 1990s. And I believe that's partly because that's when CBT became mainstream, and it validated a lot of the ideas that we find in Stoicism. And then in the year 2000, references to Stoicism start to accelerate in popularity.
So what happened in the year 2000?
Well, what happened in the year 2000 was...
Besides the movie.
That's what happened.
The Gladiator movie.
Gladiator came out. And in the first act of Gladiator, Richard Harris portrays Marcus Aurelius.
Right.
And he talks, or Commodus talks about the 4 cardinal virtues, if I remember rightly. And there's one or two other kind of like vague references to Stoic-like ideas in it. But people became interested in Roman history. Suddenly people thought Roman history was cool again. Sword and Sandals epics were salvaged from like the cinematic dumpster. And people thought it was cool again
But there must have been something else in the culture.
Yeah.
That Stoicism was feeding. There must have been some kind of need.
Stoicism's rise to prominence was overdetermined. There were multiple things that converged to make it popular again. So the other thing, there are 4 things that people typically tell me. I've been lucky to speak to thousands of people over the years about Stoicism. And so they tell me, and this reflects my own interest in Stoicism in some ways. So they'll tell me that they see Stoicism as a Western alternative to Buddhism, right? Meditation, mindfulness, Buddhism was kind of popular like when I was a young guy.
A secular solution.
They see it also as a secular alternative to Christianity, right? Something like 75% of people in Stoicism online communities today are agnostics or atheists. Now, the ancient Stoics worshipped Zeus, right? But they worshipped Zeus because their philosophy led them to the conclusion that the universe was a rational being and so on, not because of a leap of faith or because of scripture or tradition, right? So their religious beliefs, it seems to me, are subordinate to their philosophical beliefs. And I think that's why people see Stoicism as a more rational philosophical alternative to religion. That's my way of understanding it anyway, but that's what they tell me. And then the other thing is, like me, they see it as a more down-to-earth and practical alternative to modern academic philosophy. So like, I'm really into philosophy, but I'm looking for something that's a bit more practical. Boom, Stoicism. And finally, again, a bit like me, they see it as a more philosophical alternative to CBT. So you go to CBT, let's say it works, you pop out the other end of therapy and you're all cured and better and happy and stuff like that. And then you think, what next? Maybe these ideas that help me get over my panic attacks and my depression have implications for life in general. But CBT, generally speaking, does not attempt to equip you with a philosophy of life, right? Basically.
You don't have a set of rules and guidelines on how to behave, and
you've got some general ideas, but it doesn't ascend to the level of a whole philosophy of life. If you took CBT and tried to turn it into a philosophy of life, I like to ask people, what do you think you'd end up with? And often they say, you'd probably end up with something that's a bit like Stoicism, right? It would kind of converge. So people often at the end of CBT are like, I want something deeper and more meaningful and bigger and permanent, right? CBT, it's like, it's for life, not just for Christmas kind of thing. Where do I go with this now? Stoicism gives them that framework, basically.
So Albert Ellis, he said that CBT originated.
He was a cool guy.
He was
a very cool guy.
He was one of the top psychologists of the 20th century.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and he said CBT originated with Stoicism or emerged out of Stoicism to a certain extent.
He called what he did rational emotive behavior therapy.
Okay.
It's the earliest form of CBT or the main precursors of CBT. He was originally a psychoanalytic therapist and actually a sex therapist. And then he did something that I always think is really cool. He got disillusioned with it, kind of like I did with existentialism, and he kind of scrapped the whole thing and went back to the drawing board. He was like, I'm going to start again completely from scratch. And so he'd read Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus when he was a teenager. And like you, he was like, that kind of makes sense. Like, why can't we just have a psychotherapy that does what those dudes were saying? And so he built a new approach to psychotherapy in his backyard, right, out of some planks and nails that he had lying around,
Right.
out of Stoicism, and other influence. He was influenced a bit by Buddhism and reading in philosophy, but he repeatedly says that Stoicism was one of the main philosophical inspirations for rational emotive behavior therapy. And then Aaron T. Beck, who's the other main pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy, basically just repeats the same thing. He calls Stoicism the philosophical origins of cognitive behavioral therapy. So when I began reading books on CBT, when I was like 20 or something like that, I noticed that they contained this quote from Epictetus that said, people are distressed not by events, but by their opinions about them.
Interpretation of events, yeah.
Yeah. And that's in every book, or was in every book in CBT. It was a cliche. Ellis taught that to every single one of his patients, as far as I know, taught it to all of his students, put it in almost all of his books. And so I read that and I thought, I promise you, initially, as a young guy, I was like, this is awesome. People that are doing CBT must have loads of other things to say about Stoicism. I was like, I can't wait. I'm reading these CBT books thinking, when are they going to get back to the Stoicism stuff? Because this idea is the fundamental premise of CBT. You could call it the cognitive model or a cognitive model of emotion. At the time, in the 50s, there was a cognitive revolution in psychology happening. So by cognition, we mean thoughts and beliefs. And Ellis was part of that. You could say it led to a cognitive revolution in psychotherapy. So people in therapy will jostle up in their initial session, and usually what they do is they say, I'm a bit depressed, or I'm kind of angry, or I've got these anxiety attacks and stuff. And then what they do is go and tell you how awful it is, and it's destroying their relationships, it's giving them stomach ulcers, they can't sleep at night, it's making it hard for them to perform at work. So they'll give you a big list of reasons why it sucks to have depression or anxiety or whatever. Now, implicitly, those are all motivations to change. Like, that would make you strongly motivated to change. There's a whole list of things that suck about this. This is why I should change. But then normally what happens is clients express what therapists sometimes call stuckness. So they'll go, but I can't help it. After having talked them, painted themselves into this verbal corner, like, it's really awful. It's destroying my marriage. It's making me ill. But I can't help it. It's just how I feel. And Ellis would say, but it's not just how you feel, is it?
It's how you think.
It's also how you think. Yeah. Right, and that's the revolution, because as soon as you recognize
thinking patterns can lead to emotions.
Yeah,
that was kind of a big revolution. Right?
Yeah, that was a revolutionary idea. Apart from the fact it was 2,500 years old, it was revolutionary, right? Because Freud and Jung and all those guys didn't really emphasize that sufficiently, and it was the cognitive therapists that really highlighted this idea. And it was based on many, many emerging research studies, and clinical trials supported it. But Ellis thought, like all psychotherapists, all evidence-based psychotherapists, have this weird role that they occupy, almost like public health, whereby they read loads of really complicated research studies with really impenetrable statistics. And then they have to somehow translate that into plain English for a 13-year-old kid that's been kicked out of school, like for an elderly Jewish matriarch, from a bus driver with a lot of facial tattoos, for like all just random, ordinary, everyday people. Right, a whole variety of people. You think, how am I going to get all this research to make sense to ordinary people? And Ellis was trying to explain it to people, and he said, look, basically, it's like this quote from Epictetus says,
It's your interpretation of the idea of it.
And people would be like, that makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes when you're working with humans, sometimes when you're working with people, you just say something and it clicks, and you're like, I'm going to keep saying that, because people seem to find it relatable, they understand it. So Ellis latched on to this quote because his clients and students latched on to it, and that makes perfect sense. And it's the fundamental premise of Stoicism, fundamental premise of cognitive therapy. When you start from that premise, you're probably going to arrive at fairly similar conclusions. Because, for example, if you say the cause of our problems to a large extent is cognitive, then it kind of implies that the cure might be cognitive in nature as well. Essentially what it's saying, I should phrase it like this. The way I would normally phrase it is that our beliefs shape our emotions to a greater extent than people normally recognize, right? Because a lot of people might be like, well, it's obvious that our beliefs shape our emotions. No, they shape your emotions more than you normally recognize, right? How would you deal with that? Well, you should identify what the beliefs are that shape your emotions, right? So maybe if you're anxious, it's because you believe something catastrophic is about to happen and you won't be able to cope with it. Now, you might be wrong about that. You might be right about it. You might be exaggerating the severity of the perceived catastrophe. You might be exaggerating the probability of it happening. You might be underestimating your ability to cope with it if it did happen. So you could be wrong on many different levels. And questioning and challenging your thinking changes how you feel. You know, that's what the clinical trials repeatedly demonstrate in CBT.
So CBT kind of identified the fact that if you review your attitudes and your thinking patterns, you can grasp partially control of your emotions and your interpretations of your problems. And so that was in 1950s. But
Yeah.
now, what happened in a society where this sudden emergent Stoicism that you say is starting in 2000? I cannot believe that it was only the movie. There must have been something that was happening in the culture, the arrival of the internet, something else was going on for us to say, hey, let's go back to this old.
Well, there were the four things that I mentioned earlier are factors, right? So there's trends for things like Buddhism, but then people are like, is there a version of Buddhism that's kind of more consistent with my cultural norms and values and stuff like that? People became more disillusioned with Christianity, but they sort of started to look for a philosophy of life that could potentially replace it, and so on and so on. But there is something else.
So there was a rise in spirituality also in late 90s, like the New Age movement.
I'll tell you what I think.
Alternative,
Stoicism has grown in popularity to some extent in parallel with the internet, right? It's a product in some ways, or its resurgence to some extent is a product of the information age, right? That's not a coincidence. Ancient philosophy, to some extent, arose in parallel with democracy in Athens. Socrates was born about a generation or so after the original democracy was founded in Athens. It was still a fledgling, nascent baby democracy when Socrates was alive and watching it. He saw its rise and he saw its collapse into a civil war and a dictatorship called the 30 Tyrants. So Socrates' philosophical method, and Socrates is like a precursor of the Stoics. He's their granddaddy. His method grew up in a culture where demagogues were seizing control of the political assembly and where rhetoric, the thing that Plato emphasizes, and it seems clear in ancient philosophy, is that political oratory, rhetoric, or if you like, propaganda, was on the rise. And its influence was surprisingly pervasive. Suddenly people were being manipulated on a much bigger and more systematic scale than ever before. And it was a life or death matter. People could be whipped up into a frenzy and go off in a military The Athenians, cut a long story short, during the Peloponnesian War, Socrates lived during the Peloponnesian War, it lasted 27 years. It was huge. It went on and on and on. And in the middle of it, the Athenians went on this expedition to Sicily, where they lost about 40,000 troops, which is kind of unprecedented in ancient warfare. Normally you have a battle, sometimes not that many people actually die, because once you're losing, you retreat often. So the casualties aren't necessarily colossal like that, but they really invested in this campaign because they got whipped up by orators into doing it, and it was absolutely catastrophic for them. So the ancient Athenian philosophers were like, wow, that's the power of rhetoric for you. It could destroy our whole society. It led to factions and division that it culminated in the Civil War, and collapsed into a dictatorship, basically.
So we needed a rhetoric as a defense mechanism against propaganda.
We need a counter-rhetoric.
A counter-rhetoric,
something like logic, reason, the Socratic method, to protect ourselves. But Socrates, maybe a good way of putting it is Socrates correctly observed that there's a problem in defending ourselves. And it's a great problem. It's a problem that we still have today.
Which is?
The problem is that he put it like this. Socrates said, wisdom is related to a famous maxim that's engraved outside the temple of the god Apollo at Delphi. says, "Gnoth thyseauton," or know thyself. And he said, to know yourself would almost be like an eye that could see itself. And wisdom would be like the eye that sees itself. How cool is that as an image? He says to his interlocutor, the guy he's talking to happens to be a famous Athenian general and statesman called Alcibiades. How could the eye see itself? Alcibiades, pretty sharp, says, "I guess it would look in a mirror, Socrates." People thought Socrates was an idiot because they thought he was a buffoon, because often he would ask questions that were kind of simplistic to begin with, but then he would ask harder questions.
Right.
And he would say, "Yeah, you're right. So what's the best mirror for the human soul?" Alcibiades is like, "I don't know, you've got me there, buddy." Like, I think Socrates thought the best mirror for the human soul was to engage in a sincere dialogue with someone else about the most important questions in life. Kind of like we do in some ways. The closest thing to that now would be psychotherapy. Yeah. Like we obtain a mirror for the human soul in psychotherapy.
I see where you're going. So just to come back to why Stoicism became so popular, I guess what I'm getting from your answer, and I'd like to point out, you just wrote a book called How to Think Like Socrates. I did not get a chance to read it. I read this book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is your best-selling book from what I gathered. 300,000 copies plus.
Something like that, yeah.
Amazing book, by the way. I really, really liked it. So what you're saying is that the emergence of internet brought propaganda to our homes, to our cell phones, everywhere, to our toilet, to our beds. And we needed a cognitive thinking solution to defend ourselves. And we rediscovered what originally Socrates started to build as a
something else
intellectual defense mechanism against old propaganda. Is that a fair way to put it?
I would add something else that's missing in many cases is
that's a very interesting idea, by the way.
A parent or a friend who might talk sense into you. Like that, I think that's part of the problem here. You know, I don't know exactly what's shifted there, but I feel like in the ancient world and throughout history, one of the things that's helped us to maintain perspective in life is talking to other human beings, like having friends, parents, siblings that we can talk to about politics and about depression and about the meaning of life and potentially. And I think people have stopped having those conversations as much with real people. And then what they do instead is watch Joe Rogan or, watch like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate or, whatever it is that they're consuming on the internet. And so they become kind of passive consumers of information, philosophy, values, not really in a critical, dialogical way. I think it's when we interact with other people and we discuss our values with them, like we do in psychotherapy, we gain greater self-awareness. You can't perceive your own biases unless you become an eye that sees itself.
So the two-way communication is missing.
Yeah.
How do we get that, though? Like,
well,
what do? You text people, like, online?
I think we should talk to people more. We should be having more. What does Socrates do all day long, every day? Is he talks to people. He talked to random people. He was crazy for talking to people. He talked to rich people, poor people, foreigners, slaves, and most controversially of all, Socrates did philosophy with women. That was not normal. It was mainly young, wealthy guys, Athenian citizens, privileged classes, that were the kind of bread and butter of the sophists. The places they did philosophy, women and foreigners often weren't even allowed to set foot, in some of the gymnasia in Athens. Socrates wandered around all over the place. He went to the Piraeus, the kind of more working class harbour of Athens. He went to the Agora. He went around people's houses. He just did philosophy with people in the street. He kind of did philosophy in a shopping. It would be like doing it in a shopping mall to do it in the Agora. So Socrates, his approach to philosophy was, I'll tell you something. I think here's a way I would tell the story of Socrates. The oracle said no man is wiser than Socrates. And he thought, I need to test this. So I believe that the first thing he did was go and find the wisest person, a man who was a professional wise man, who was known in his day as the wisest man alive. And that guy was called Protagoras. he was the first of the sophists, and Socrates had a famous conversation with him. And Socrates in Plato's Apology says that when he spoke to wise men, he realized often they weren't really wise at all. They couldn't answer his questions. They became confused when he questioned them about their assumptions. And over time, he began to question more and more people. And he realized that people of no social status, who were unknown and maybe lower class, were often wiser than the professional wise men were. But if we look at the career of Socrates, it's often been observed that over time, he seems to engage progressively more in conversations with young men in Athens. Because I think nobody in Athens considered the youth to be wise.
Mm-hmm.
But Socrates thought that was liberating because these guys were willing to admit that they were wrong. Whereas a professional wise man is never going to enjoy admitting that he's wrong. It makes him look stupid. And his money, he comes from charging people a hefty fee to share his wisdom with them. People would memorize what the sophists said and repeat it verbatim. Yeah. So if Socrates questioned them and suddenly they couldn't answer questions about it, it jeopardized their income. It made them look kind of stupid. So they didn't really like the Socratic method. Whereas young people were like, I don't know Socrates, I think I know what justice is, but maybe I'm wrong, buddy. And they were more flexible in their thinking. They had what we call cognitive flexibility. And I think Socrates realized that everything about Socrates is ironic, right? I think he realized that ironically, those with the greatest reputation for wisdom were kind of inaccessible to the Socratic method, right? They were too arrogant in their wisdom to really question things and change, to engage in dialogue. But the young who were more open-minded, more flexible, it's like saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Right.
It was more profitable to question them.
Can you define the Socratic method in like 4 bullet points?
Yeah. I think there's different ways of describing it. First of all, we see it in action. Socrates never sits down and says, let me explain my method to you. But we see him doing it in all of the dialogues, right? So it's a dialogical technique, usually where you have a partner. Typically, Socrates asks people to define an important concept like wisdom, justice, courage, piety in a sentence. That in itself is a big step for many people. So in a few words, like how would you describe what you think justice is? Or can you give some examples to try and define it? And then he doesn't really ask formulaic questions. He tends to brainstorm possible exceptions and counter evidence to their definition. So I'll tell you a little story. This is often overlooked, right? I mean, when I read the Platonic dialogues, and we also have many dialogues, we have about 37 dialogues from Plato. We have about 40 or 50 from a guy called Xenophon as well, people sometimes don't know about. There were probably hundreds of Socratic dialogues in the ancient world, but most of them have been lost,
yeah.
right?
You keep saying, I heard you saying that Plato's Apology is a book that everybody should read, right?
Yeah.
That's the one that you would recommend everybody to hop onto.
It's a masterpiece. It's the most profound philosophical text in the Western canon. Because Plato was a highly talented writer, because it describes a very dramatic historical scene. And some people find it frustrating because it's not like a conventional philosophy lecture, or it's not like a conventional philosophical dialogue. There's little bits of dialogue in it. Socrates says things that are really unconvincing to many people. He expresses arguments that seem kind of incomplete and fragmentary. He arrives at sort of extreme conclusions. He says things that are a bit ambiguous. But nevertheless, it's a treasure house of inspiration and ideas. One of Socrates' students said that when you spoke to him, it was like being bitten by a small insect, like a mosquito. And they said that at first you didn't even notice. And then maybe the same day, or maybe the next day, suddenly you've kind of got an itch there. See, Socrates says some stuff. Years later, you're still thinking about it. You might read it and think, this is nonsense. This guy's an idiot.
Do you think that Plato's original writings were actually close to what Socrates was saying? I know that his later writings were more like Plato is, like he was putting more of who he was, but do you think the early ones really represented what Socrates was?
We call this the Socratic problem. It's a vexed problem. The sources that we have describing Socrates are basically often considered to be semi-fictional in nature. Plato only really knew Socrates in late towards the end of his life, so he wouldn't have seen him when he was engaged in dialogues with Protagoras, for example.
What's the gap? How long did they meet? Like, how long did they know each other?
We don't know exactly, but if I remember rightly, Plato knew Socrates for around about the last 5 or 10 years of his life.
That's a decent amount of time.
Oh, he was like 60 by then. He lived to be 70. He didn't see him throughout most of his career. Many of the dialogues are set earlier in Socrates' life. So, for example, Plato says this is a whole conversation that Socrates had with Protagoras. That was decades before he even knew him, right? So it's probably the case that Plato is saying, this is what I reckon Socrates would have said if he had a conversation with this guy. Or I've heard kind of maybe fragments of it, and I'm going to reconstruct it like this.
Is there anything we're 100% sure or 90 or 80% sure?
The Apology is the closest, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that, but the argument is that if Plato had completely fabricated the Apology, then people might have commented on that and said, but we all heard, there were 500 jurors and they all heard what Socrates said. And what you've written down is absolutely nothing like it. So it would have been more kind of shocking if he'd misrepresented the gist of what he was saying in court. We have another apology.
Do we have critics of Plato's writings and saying, hey, this is not what Socrates was saying?
Not really, except there's like a comment in a later author called Diogenes Laertius, where he claims
the Cynic.
No, not the Cynic, another writer, another Diogenes. Diogenes Laertius says that Socrates read one of Plato's early dialogues, which seems unlikely, but it's not impossible. And he said, this young man's just making up stuff that, putting words in my mouth. Now, whether that's true or not, it certainly expresses skepticism about the content of Plato's writing. Also, this is, when you study classics, there's often like tiny little fragments of evidence that like carry a lot of weight, like do a lot of work. So one of them is that Aristotle says in passing, Aristotle was Plato's student, just as Plato was Socrates' student. Aristotle says in passing that Plato was the first person to introduce the concept of what he calls the forms. People may have heard of Plato's theory of forms. Now, in the later dialogues, in the middle dialogues, Socrates is shown talking extensively about the theory of forms. If that's true, and that Plato was the first person to introduce that idea, then Socrates could not actually have had those conversations because it's Plato's theory. It's being put in his mouth. That seems likely. I mean, usually what scholars think, and there's debate about this, is that the Platonic dialogues divide into sort of early, middle, and late periods of Plato's writing, and that the earlier dialogues are probably closer to what Socrates said, and that maybe the Apology is particularly likely to at least capture the gist of what Socrates said. I believe, and there's some disagreement about this, but I believe that Xenophon's dialogues are probably closer to what Socrates said. And by the way, Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates never mentions the theory of forms at all, ever. He's, in fact, maybe this is why I like him. In Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates, I would say, comes across even more like a psychotherapist. People are probably used to seeing Socrates talk about metaphysics and theory of knowledge and stuff like that, but they might not realize that sometimes, and particularly in Xenophon, there'll be dialogues where he's talking to his friends and family members about how they're angry with each other, and he's using the Socratic method really explicitly
as a
therapy, like to help people overcome their anger and stuff. There's one where he talks to his son, Lamprocles. He's probably like 15, 16, 17, and he's going on about how his mum is really irritating, and Socrates talks to him about the anger that he has towards his mother and uses Socratic questioning to get him to reflect on it. And the first thing he says, basically, he does this in other dialogues as well. The first thing he says in those cases is basically to question whether other people feel the same way as he does about the same thing. So, do other people find Xanthippe's behavior intolerable? Well, actually, Socrates himself would be a counterexample, because it's like water off a duck's back to him. He's not really bothered by it. So then in that case, is it intrinsically intolerable, or is it to some extent got to do with your perspective, your attitude and your values, like how irritating you find it? I think Socrates' comments about that are particularly insightful, but he definitely, if you look at those bits of dialogue, he really looks like a psychotherapist or a relationships counselor, way ahead of the curve, buddy.
So your last book is about Socrates.
Yeah.
And you were interested in Socrates because he had something to do with the formation of rhetorics and Stoicism. So what kind of impact did he have on the Stoicism that came 400, 500 years later? Yeah.
Well, Stoicism originated about 100 years after the death of Socrates. Marcus Aurelius, who's the last Stoic standing, the last famous Stoic of antiquity, died round about 500 years, over 500 years after Socrates died, basically. So to Marcus Aurelius, Socrates was kind of ancient history, if you can imagine that. Sometimes we lose perspective on that when we're reading these guys, but Marcus Aurelius is talking about Socrates. He's talking about someone that lived over 5 centuries before him, and yet he still idolizes him, and that's one of his main role models. Socrates, I see, as the godfather or granddaddy of Stoicism.
And why? What were the elements in his philosophy that were important for Stoicism?
Well, for a start, Epictetus, who's the most influential Stoic teacher. I think Epictetus has a claim to be the most influential teacher of philosophy in Roman history, actually.
So he's the most quoted person in Meditations.
Yeah,
Marcus Aurelius actually never met him, right?
No.
They never met.
Their lives overlapped.
He moved to Greece.
Yeah, he moved to Greece, and Marcus, we don't know exactly when he died, but he probably died when Marcus was round about 15. So as a side note, I imagine Marcus must have been gutted, because the most important philosopher in Roman history, perhaps, and certainly of his lifetime, he could maybe have met him. Maybe he was thinking, one day I'm going to travel to Greece and I'm going to sit at the feet of this great Stoic teacher, but he didn't quite get the chance to do it. But what he did get is a pile of notes from his teacher, a guy called Junius Rusticus, from his private library. He gave him what I would think at that time was probably unpublished and maybe unknown transcripts, like a bootleg of Epictetus's lessons. That must have blown Marcus Aurelius' mind, and I imagine that he studied them religiously. And so in the Meditations, we see him quoting Epictetus more often than he quotes anyone else. The men who taught Marcus Aurelius probably idolized, and some of them had probably met Epictetus as well. That's partly why he's so enamored of him.
Okay, so what did Epictetus took from Socrates?
Epictetus mentions Socrates about twice as often, if I remember rightly, as he mentions the founders of Stoicism. It's kind of a big deal. He tells his own students repeatedly that they should emulate Socrates and he's their ultimate role model, right? The Apology in particular, he sees as being this kind of template for how to face death and how to face injustice. So in a way, he's more interested in Socrates' example as a role model than he is in the content of Plato's philosophy. Like the Stoics aren't remotely interested in the theory of forms. They completely reject that. But they're very interested in the example of virtue and wisdom that Socrates provides them with. He's their role model.
So the contents of your book here list certain values or certain principles of Stoicism, like view from above. Can you maybe break down in bullet points what are the most essential ideas of Stoicism?
Yeah.
Maybe from historically, or what they are for Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is how I'd explain it to you. Stoicism actually had a slogan that sums up its core philosophy. Marcus Aurelius repeats it many times. It originated with Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. and it's that the goal of life is to live in accord with nature. Now, as Epictetus says, you can say that, but to understand what it means takes many words and some discussion, because partly what they mean by nature is paradoxical. It's not living in accord with your animal nature, but they believe that the highest component of human nature is reason, because reason can reflect on everything else that we do. If you are hungry, you're sleepy, you have these kind of animal physical urges, reason is capable of reflecting on them and saying, maybe that's healthy or maybe it's unhealthy right now. Maybe it's natural or unnatural to do this. So reason is the kind of king of nature. Because it's able to reflect on and assign value to everything. Even if it can't resist some of our inclinations or urges, nevertheless it can comment on them and form an opinion about them, right? So the Stoics believe that to live in accord with nature would be to live in accord with reason. And we don't. We have this toolbox that nature has given us, and we use it inconsistently, to say the least. We use it badly. We're like a half-finished piece of poetry. We're like a circle with a piece missing from it. We're kind of incomplete. Nature has clearly indicated what we're meant to do. It's given us the tools, but it's up to us to use them, is what the Stoics would say. We now have the freedom to use reason well or to use it badly.
Okay.
And they think it's relatively clear that if we were to use reason to our full potential, we would achieve wisdom. And if we apply that wisdom to our social and interpersonal relationships, we would achieve the virtue of justice, as they call it, dikaiosune in Greek. Justice is about
So to use the reason as a kind of a filter between what is happening to us and how we feel about things, and like to dissect, observe our emotions and be more resilient towards them, and
to reflect on our impressions. We call them, the Stoics talk a lot about impressions that we have, ideas that pop into our mind, sense impressions that we have, our superficial initial thoughts about things, how things seem to us, how we feel about things. Might be right, might be wrong. I might feel as if nobody likes me and everybody hates me, but I might be wrong about that. So the Stoics want us to question appearances and use reason to get to the underlying reality. And they think if we do that, we'll approach wisdom.
When we first met last week, you told me you wanted to speak about anger. And to be honest, my first reaction was, is this really the emotion we're going to pick up all the possible emotions? There's so many better subjects. And my opinion on anger was, it's not something that's good. We should just avoid it. And especially as a guy, I know that anger can lead to aggression and violence. And I'm trying to not get angry, not act on it. But then I heard you talk about anger, and I was completely mind blown.
Anger is the royal road to self-improvement.
Yes, I was. I'm gonna let you talk about it, but just want to say one thing. From what I gathered, anger is a coping mechanism that we use to stop other negative emotions overcoming us. So let's say we're sad.
To some extent,
it's a coping emotion. Yeah. So let's say we're sad or anxious. Yeah. We're going to become angry. We're going to switch to anger, so we stop being sad or anxious. Is that correct? And it's a very destructive emotion.
I think people kind of vaguely know this to some extent. Again, it's like often you're validating insights that people perceive vaguely. So I think people roughly know, like sometimes somebody hurts your feelings, you get angry, right?
Yeah.
But then we can dig in, like psychologists and psychotherapists, we can start to look at what's going on there? Like, what's the actual dynamic? Why do you get angry, and how does it work?
What's the evolutionary advantage of anger? I mean, it sets up action.
Yeah.
In motion. It's going to get us focused on one thing and react really fast to it. But it's
threats in our environment.
Extremely disadvantaged in like everyday life. Let's say somebody cuts us off in the street. You don't want to act on that, right? You just want to
the environment,
keep driving safely.
We live in a much more complex and nuanced environment now, where anger is like a really crude tool. It doesn't really serve a useful function in the way that it would if you were a small furry animal. You know, like if you went back in the day when you were a small furry animal, you know, you got angry, it would produce adrenaline, would focus your attention narrowly on the threats that you perceive in your environment. And if there's another furry animal, if it's bigger than you, you probably feel anxious and run away from it. If it's smaller than you, you might beat the bejesus out of it, right? So
it's an evolutionary artifact.
Yeah, right? It's an evolutionary artifact, but it doesn't serve us well in modern society for a number of reasons. One is just that society is more complex, and many of our problems are social rather than, threats and like physical threats in our environment. Another one is that, potentially some of the threats we experience are our own thoughts and feelings. And if we focus too much on those and turn our attention inwards, they don't go away. We actually amplify them by doing that. So the strategy that we would use to beat the bejesus out of a small furry animal might backfire in a relationship with our wife or husband. It might also backfire if we get angry with ourselves and start internally beating the bejesus out of ourselves, ruminating and self-criticizing.
So let's take an example. I would love to have an example. So let's say you get angry in your everyday life. Let's say you're driving down the street, down on the carry, and somebody cuts you off. And all of a sudden you feel like you're accelerating, you're really mad, you want to go back after that person. So what would be the first step? You identify the anger that you overcome with, and then you try to reflect why it happened, when it started, and then just
I've got a better example.
Yeah, you go for it.
All right. This is a real thing that happened to me last week, believe it or not. Brace yourself for this, right?
Okay.
So a bunch of things have happened to me over the years and my friends. Funny thing was when I used to teach therapists, and I used to give as an example, suppose somebody walks up to you unexpectedly in the street and just spits in your face.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond? You have a kind of reflex, like you're probably going to get angry, right? Instinctively, if something like that happens. I was walking along the street here, pushing my baby in a pram, and somebody shoulder checked me crossing the road, rammed into me really hard, and I got angry. And I turned around and I went, "What the hell did you do that for?" And the guy ran up to me and punched me in the jaw in the middle of the street for no reason. Right?
In Montreal?
Yeah. Like a week ago. Guy punched me in the face in the street. Luckily he wasn't a very good punch. Like he was carrying a bag in his right hand, so he punched me with his left hand. So I think I got off lightly. But I think I made a mistake in yelling at him, right? I mean, you could say, well, that's like an instinct. Of course you're going to go, hey, what the hell did you do that for, buddy? But I think by doing that, I provoked him. He ran at me, hit me. I had my baby with me. My priority might have been to say, hey, I just need to distance myself from this guy as quickly as possible. So in retrospect, I made a mistake in that regard, but it was reflex-like. I guess I could potentially work on that. Like I'd need to prepare myself a bit for similar situations. What interested me was I stopped being angry the minute he punched me.
Why?
Because I looked at the guy and I thought he was out of his mind, right? And immediately, it's interesting, one of the things, I'll tell you another story. One of the reasons I'm interested in anger is that when I was a young guy, I was really angry. Like a lot of people today, I feel your pain. I was consumed by anger until I was like in my mid-20s or something like that. The poet William Blake said the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. He also said if the fool would persist in his folly, he would succeed in becoming wise. And sometimes you'll find drug addicts or alcoholics or people that have problems like anger reach a crisis point, in some cases, if they're lucky, where they turn their whole life around and they become a different person. Mm-hmm. And I think that happened to me. I reached a point where my anger was kind of so pervasive and so extreme that it just started to seem ridiculous to me. And you'll often hear people saying that. They'll say it just started to seem like it wasn't worth it. It seemed pointless. And so I started to unravel it, dissect it, question it. And Stoicism helped me to do that. But the feeling I had when I came to my senses was there's no point getting angry with this guy. In fact, I think very quickly I thought, if I get angry with this guy, if I get in a scrap with him or something like that, I just endanger my baby.
Escalating, for no reason,
It would be a ridiculous coping strategy.
So what happened? The guy walked away?
I turned around and walked away, and he walked off in the opposite direction, right? And I thought that's the best thing to. Why would I get in a scrap with a guy in the middle of the street in a blizzard? My baby's in the pram. It would be a stupid thing to do. Only anger would cause you to do something as idiotic as that. Now, one of the things about anger, I'll tell you some things that I think people find interesting about anger. The Stoics said that anger is temporary insanity, and they were not far from the truth in that, in the sense that anger is accompanied by pronounced cognitive biases. which people often are unaware of, but they can, again, have this vague sense that we're not thinking straight when we're angry.
Your
we're
vision
not
just
rational.
like,
Your vision becomes narrow. But when people are anxious, they typically overestimate risk. They do this thing called catastrophizing. So we have a bias when we're anxious. We're not thinking straight when we're really anxious. So small threats seem much more dangerous to us. We focus on the worst case scenario and blow things out of proportion. When people are angry, interestingly, they do the opposite, and they typically underestimate risk. Now, there are reasons maybe why they do that, things connected with it, but people who underestimate risk typically expose themselves and other people to danger. Angry people get themselves and everyone else killed if they're not careful.
So being angry is like being drunk, pretty much.
It's like being drunk. We're less inhibited. Angry people are notoriously impulsive. I mean, I should say there are different forms of anger. There's some kind of variance and so on, but we're speaking in kind of general terms here about the most common forms of anger. So typically when people are angry, they do the opposite of anxious people and they underestimate risk. So they do dangerous stuff. Another thing that goes hand in hand with that is that angry people seem to have inhibited their ability to evaluate the consequences of their actions. And it's like that part of your brain is switched off and you can't really clearly think through the consequences of your actions very well. And that partly leads people to do things they regret when they're angry. So afterwards, when you're not angry anymore, you think, well, that was stupid. Like, why didn't I see what the consequences of getting in a scrap with the guy in the middle of the street with my baby would be? It just seemed like the only option. Angry people also tend to have a very rigid and narrow sense of their options in terms of coping with stress or a threat. So normally...
Some kind of short circuit type situation,
Usually when you're faced with a problem, you think, well, I've got a couple of options here. I could run, I could fight, I could call the cops, I could do this, I could do that. You know, you choose between options normally, and typically you kind of evaluate the consequences of different courses of action. You'll hear angry people saying, this was the only thing I could do. I had to punch the guy. What else could I do? Right. So they kind of frame it as if they've only got one conceivable option, right? They have this very narrow sense. So they feel like they're kind of driven into taking action. Maybe that helps them to take action more quickly, but it leads to impulsive behavior that people often regret afterwards because they're not able to fully think through the consequences of it.
So, okay, so as a Stoic, what would you do? So a guy hits you in the shoulder down the street, you have a baby with you, it's a blizzard. The right thing to do would be to reflect on it instead of acting right away and getting overwhelmed by anger.
I think it's an opportunity. Well, the right thing to do, it's not rocket science. You know, the right thing to do is walk away.
Yeah.
You know, and I called the cops afterwards.
But internally, I mean, like, what would be the process there? Just be like super aware of your emotions. And
you should prepare yourself in advance better than I had done, right?
You're an expert in the subject. Like,
I'm an expert.
What about a common man? Or like, what odds do we have if you make that kind of mistake?
Yeah, but you know, I haven't prepared myself for every set. Nobody's perfect, right? Actually, the Stoics. Let me tell you something about the Stoics. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the followers of Plato are called Platonists, and the followers of Aristotle are called Aristotelians. And the followers of Epicurus are called Epicureans, and the followers of Pythagoras are called Pythagoreans. But the followers of Zeno are not called Zenonians, luckily for me. It would sound like they're Martians or something like that, right? We call them Stoics.
Why is that?
Why is that? Because the founders of some of the other schools of ancient philosophy claimed that they were wise or enlightened, and Zeno disavowed wisdom. He said, I'm on a journey, same as you guys. I don't claim to be perfectly wise. I have biases and I'm flawed. I believe he said something similar to what we read Seneca saying. We're told that the founders of Stoicism claimed that they were not wise, and that was unusual. So they're called Stoics, by the way, after the Stoa Poikile, or painted porch. It's the place that they used to hang out in the Agora, basically. Okay. And faces the Acropolis, right? And, you know, like, what Seneca says in one of his letters is, don't view me like a physician speaking to you, the patient. Don't view me as an expert, but view me as a fellow patient in the bed beside you who's been undergoing treatment for longer. And that sounds a lot like a kind of peer support model, a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous or something like that. It's rather than a doctor-patient like a therapist-client model. And I think what Seneca says in that passage is probably typical of Stoicism, perhaps all the way back to Zeno, the founder. So the Stoics think, we would risk becoming conceited, if we thought that we were perfect. So we have to accept our fallibility. None of us are perfect sages, as they put it, or the wise man that the sophist proclaims himself to be. The minute you think that you're enlightened, you're conceited, and that actually becomes an obstacle to wisdom, potentially. I think that's the paradox that Socrates was aware of, and the Stoics seem aware of that as well. But what would you do in that situation is, ideally, you'd prepare yourself for it in advance.
Yeah, so how do you absorb, and how do you control yourself not to react like you did?
Well, I can tell you a bunch of secrets, right? Like the first thing is, I could say broadly speaking, there's a couple of things such as noticing what we call the early warning signs of anger. I mean, actually, like you could say, if you're training therapy clients in behavior change, like one initial step is to get them to spot when they're becoming angry, but to notice things that previously went unnoticed, where your blind spots are, right? So to really notice the very earliest signs of anger emerging. And there are things that people typically don't notice, like changes in their voice, their breathing, their facial expression, their eye movements, that might be obvious to an observer. And noticing those things, like, for example, do you frown? Hardly anyone notices if they frown, but, people typically frown when they're getting angry.
Right.
Like, generally speaking. Even animals furrow their brow, like dogs, when they're becoming aggressive. So you can look out for these early warning signs of anger and catch yourself earlier. Now, we do that in order to then use a coping strategy and interrupt it. But actually, doing that on its own often is sufficient in many cases. So people say, I felt like I was able to nip it in the bud at an earlier stage before my anger really escalated. So there's that. But also it does something that I think is the kind of magic formula of modern psychotherapy. Catching yourself earlier subtly contributes to something that we call verbal diffusion. Like we sometimes call it cognitive distancing as well. So it's hard to explain what this is, but it's become one of the central concepts in modern psychotherapy. We have to use jargon because there isn't a popular term for it. But weirdly, the Stoics were definitely aware of it.
What is it called?
We call it behavioral psychologists call it verbal diffusion.
Verbal diffusion.
Cognitive psychologists call it cognitive distancing, right?
So what would that be in practice?
It's a shift in perspective,
okay,
right? That allows you to observe your own thoughts in a detached way and to separate your thoughts from the external events that they refer to. So rather than thinking, that guy's a jerk, I would think, I'm telling myself that guy's a jerk. I'm choosing to label him as a jerk, right? He's not intrinsically a jerk. That's a label that I attach to him. It's just words that I'm associating with the guy. It's a value judgment that I'm projecting or imposing on him. But we normally fuse our value judgments with our perceptions. We think this is a catastrophe. There are no catastrophes in nature. There's just atoms moving around. We label it as a catastrophe. We project that onto it. So catching your anger early on potentially makes it easier for you to take a step back and observe yourself, almost like you're stepping to one side and looking at yourself. And when you do that, it does two things. And one of them is obvious and people love it. And the other one's more subtle and I love it. So the first thing that it does is dilute the intensity of your emotion when you are able to get a shift in perspective and see your thoughts as events that are happening in your mind. See your thoughts as something that you're doing, right? So not thinking, this guy is like, a jerk. This guy's an idiot. But realizing that you're just saying that stuff to yourself, you're projecting those labels onto him. That will typically reduce the intensity of your emotion. The second thing it does is increase cognitive flexibility. So it makes it easier for you to view the situation from multiple different perspectives. And that tends to make us better at problem solving, which changes our actual behavior, and that benefits us more in the longer term. So if I'm able to notice that I'm just choosing to view it that way, I might think, well, other people might see it differently. What you see as a threat, I might see as an opportunity. What you see as a catastrophe, I might see as something bad but not catastrophic. What you see as, absolutely awful, I might see as something that sucks but is temporary. So by changing my perspective and being able to look at things from different angles, it becomes easier for me to problem solve, and think, oh, maybe I don't have to punch this guy in the face. Maybe there's other opportunities here. I mean, this sounds paradoxical, but
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you? So anger is obviously very destructive, potentially destructive emotion, and I can see how we can catch it early, and then the key is to maybe do nothing, just wait for it to pass. We kind of solve the problem. What about other emotions like anxiety, which not gonna go away, right? Which are not active. So what do you do with?
You'd be surprised.
It goes away.
Yeah.
Okay. But you can be anxious for like.
Let me tell you a story about anxiety, buddy.
Sure,
right?
Go for it.
Like, have you? I used to tell this story. I'm just going to tell you what I used to tell clients in therapy. I was a specialist in treating anxiety disorders, particularly social anxiety. I had a clinic in Harley Street in London for many years. That was the main thing that I did there. So let's say you've got a cat phobia, right? Simplest form of anxiety. It's different. Anxiety comes in many different flavors, but your animal phobia is like one of the simplest.
Can you take another example that's maybe a little bit more deeper? Let's say you're just not happy with your life, like something you cannot change. Because a car, you said cat or car?
Cat phobia. Let's stick with, I'm picking that example for a reason.
Okay,
so let's
go
run with it.
Go for it. Yeah, run with it. Yeah, sorry.
Because it's simple. So you've got a cat phobia. We put you in a room with a couple of cats in it, right? We can measure anxiety fairly reliably by measuring heart rate. Funnily enough, it's easy to measure heart rate, and it's a pretty robust measurement of anxiety, generally speaking. So what would happen to your heart rate if you have a cat phobia and we put you in a room with a couple of cats?
It's going to go up.
It's got up within less than 5 seconds. It's probably going to double if it's a severe phobia, like as if you were sprinting or something like that, approximately. So like Socrates again, it's like, that's an obvious question. You see your eye, you'd look in a mirror. What happens next?
You get hot. I don't know.
Well,
what most people... You want to run away?
Yeah.
You want to escape, yeah.
A lot of people wouldn't even get in the room.
Yeah.
Sometimes I find I have to drag them in, kicking and screaming. But people will run, like they want to run out the room. What happens if they don't run out the room, though, and they do something unusual, contrary to all their instincts, and they stay in the room and wait?
Can adapt.
What happens?
They calm down.
What goes up must come down. Their heart rate is going to come back down again. How long does that take? It varies. It might be 15, 20, 30 minutes, something like that. It'll reduce by like 60, 70% or something. What happens if you do it again the next day? The heart rate will go up, but not as high as before, and it will reduce more quickly. What happens if you do it the day after that, 3 days in a row? Well, the heart rate will go up, but not as high, and it will reduce even quicker again, till eventually, through repeated and prolonged exposure under controlled conditions, their phobia will extinguish, and something will happen that we call emotional habituation, because anxiety is shock horror, and most people don't expect this in a way, although in a sense we know this, but people kind of are confused about it. Anxiety tends to abate naturally or wear off naturally through prolonged exposure, like when you're in the presence of the thing that makes you anxious. If it didn't, then you wouldn't be able to adapt very easily. Like if you, again, remember when you were a little furry animal, right? And you would go in the woods and you're just at the place where you get your favourite berries, and a tree falls down and it scares the bejesus out of you, right? So your heart rate goes through the roof and you scarper, like you're terrified. And then you go back the next day and you're kind of anxious that might happen again, but nothing happens, right? Well, is your anxiety going to just remain at a severe level every time you go back to where the good berries are, even though nothing bad happens? Your anxiety has to wear off so that you can adapt to safe environments, basically. So it's natural that anxiety would abate through repeated exposure if nothing harmful actually happens in those situations. That's the basis of what we call exposure therapy. I would say exposure therapy is the single most robustly established treatment in the entire field of psychotherapy research. It has like a 90% success rate. In a short version of it might just take 3 hours or something for what we call a specific phobia or a simple phobia. Now you said, "Wow, that's easy," but what if you've got a more complicated problem, right? So some phobias are more cognitive in nature. That's our baseline example. Where it gets interesting is most anxiety can be seen as a variation of that. But for example, in PTSD, someone has lives through a trauma. PTSD is more like the anxiety is triggered by a memory rather than the sight of a cat or something like that. In social anxiety, people with social anxiety aren't really anxious about other people's faces. Like a cat phobic sees a cat and gets anxious. But social phobics don't really get their anxiety isn't really triggered by seeing people per se. It can become associated with that a bit, but it's more the fear of negative evaluation. So anxiety is triggered by the anticipation of making a mistake in public and other people thinking badly of you, basically. Mm-hmm. And so there are other forms of anxiety. Generalized anxiety is much more cognitive in nature. It's what we call the worrying disorder. People with generalized anxiety disorder ruminate. They think, what if this happens? What if that happens? How am I going to cope with it? So their anxiety is more like a conversation they have in their head. I'll tell you something. Bear with me. I'll tell you something really cool about generalized anxiety disorder. So, by the way, when people go to therapists, they are very vague about the success rate of different treatments. I used to teach therapists and I'd say, do you guys know what the different success rates are for? I was amazed how few counsellors and therapists had the faintest idea. Success rates for different treatments can vary from like 30 or 40% to 90%, depending on what the problem is. Even anxiety disorders vary a lot. So specific phobias like cat phobia, the success rate might be 90%, but generalized anxiety disorder, it might be 50 or 60%. It's a lot harder to treat. Social anxiety is about 75%. It's somewhere in between, right? So with generalized anxiety disorder, it's a tougher nut to crack. It's more cognitive. It's more human in a sense. One of the leading experts was a psychologist called Tom Borkovec, and he noticed a paradox about generalized anxiety disorder. So you get someone who's a pathological worrier. You sit them down and you ask them to worry about stuff, make themselves freak out. People who have severe worry-based anxiety will tell you that they get really, really highly anxious, right? So you can measure their galvanic skin response. You can measure their respiration. You can measure their heart rate and so on. But researchers noticed something weird when they did that, which is that people with pathological worrying, when they're in an intense anxiety episode, often don't really show physiological signs of nervous arousal. The heart rate doesn't usually go up that much. In fact, sometimes, even weirder, the heart rate decreases slightly. That's not anxiety.
It's like their baseline state.
Yeah, but they feel like they're anxious and they'll tell you that they're anxious. There's one exception to the symptoms, which is that often they exhibit symptoms of muscular tension. So they'll frown, they'll tense their neck and shoulders, which is kind of typical of anxiety. But the heart rate and other physiological measures of anxiety
are not there.
Are not really there. So you think, are you imagining that you're anxious or something? Like there's something weird going on. Borkovec introduced what's called the cognitive avoidance model of worry. So he said that paradoxically, when people have generalized anxiety disorder or they're worrying pathologically, they think they're facing their fears by having this conversation that can go on for many hours. They lie in their bed at night worrying about things. But he said in a sense they're actually using this as a form of subtle avoidance. If they were to visualize the thing that they're worrying about, their anxiety might spike. It might go up initially, but then go down, like with the cat phobia example. But by having a conversation, you're kind of jumping around from one aspect of the problem to another. So you prevent your anxiety, you prevent yourself from habituating, as we put it. You know, you have to sit in the room with the cat for 20 minutes. let's say. Or you could visualize a cat and you'd have, if you're a phobic, you'd have high anxiety and it might decline within 5 or 10 minutes if it was just a mental image, for example. So why, if worrying is thinking about something that freaks you out, does it never wear off? It just continues to spiral because we don't allow ourselves to confront the fear consistently enough for habituation to take place. We're frightened that we're going to get too anxious, so we keep our anxiety simmering at a medium level, basically permanently. And the irony is that if we just grasp the nettle and really visualize and stare, it would spike and then it would go down. So by defending ourselves against anxiety, we potentially make it worse. With social anxiety, there's something kind of in between happens. So people who have got social anxiety use all sorts of little strategies, subtle avoidance strategies to try and protect themselves. But one of the main ones is they tend to focus much more attention on themselves than people do normally when they're having a conversation. So socially anxious people think about their breathing. They imagine what their face looks like. They imagine what their voice sounds like. You know, they imagine what other people are thinking of them and how they perceive them. So their level of self-consciousness is through the roof. Normally, if you're having a conversation, you're paying attention to the person that you're talking to and you're thinking about the stuff that you're saying, the content, the ideas that you're communicating. But socially anxious people are thinking about how their voice sounds and whether their face is turning red and whether their hands are shaking and stuff like that. So their attention becomes narrowed and turned inwards, and that massively amplifies their anxiety.
So what you're saying is face your fears.
Yeah, they have to.
Is that a Stoic principle? No.
Yeah.
It is?
Yeah.
It is, yeah, face your fears.
We call it premeditatio malorum in Stoicism.
Okay.
So Seneca talks about this a lot, but all the Stoics do really. It's this idea that they think in particular we should imagine, Seneca says imagine every catastrophe that could befall you as if it's happening right now so that you can get used to it. So that you can, in particular, for Stoics to rehearse observing that it's their beliefs and value judgments that are causing the anxiety. I think that what the Stoics do when they visualize feared catastrophes is that they're rehearsing what we just called earlier cognitive distancing. So they're practicing a form of mindfulness, if you like, while they're rehearsing potential future catastrophes. So I could say, Seneca might advise me. He might say, hey, Donald, you know how you shouted at that guy and it was okay in the end, but maybe it would have been even better if you just ignored them and crossed the street with your baby.
Yeah, just moved on. Yeah.
Right. And actually, the only reason the guy punched you in the face was because you turned around and yelled at him. You didn't have to do that. So Seneca might say to me, what you should do is go away and visualize
the guy
doing it again and again. And each time you do it, like, just notice that your anger is caused by angry thoughts that you're having. So what goes with the cognitive model is a kind of cognitive theory of psychopathology. The Stoics had a cognitive theory of psychopathology. They would say different emotions are caused by different beliefs. So anxiety, I mentioned earlier, might be caused by catastrophizing, focusing on the worst case scenario, believing that something awful is going to happen and you won't be able to cope. Anger is often, and there are different types of anger, but in many cases anger that's directed towards other people kind of has to do with the belief that someone has done something unjust. You've done something wrong, buddy. You did something you shouldn't have done. And also the perception that it's kind of somehow injuring me or harmful. Yeah. So I guess the main thing that Stoics might ask me to question, they might say, okay, so the guy rammed into you in the street. That's unfair. Like, it's unjust, perhaps. But maybe he didn't fully understand what he was doing because he was out of his mind, or maybe he's got mental health issues or something like that. You can't see inside his mind, right? You don't really know what his thought process was. But also it didn't really do you any harm. Yeah. It only harms you if you choose to get upset about it. You know? And also your anger does you more. One of the Stoic slogans is that our passions do us more harm than the things that we're upset about. So fear does us more harm than the things we're frightened of. Anger, in this case, does us more harm than the thing we're angry about, for two reasons. number one, when I get angry with a guy, he punched me in the face. So my anger caused that to happen, right? But also, my anger harms me. He punched me in my face. He just hurt my jaw. Like, the most he could do, is break my teeth or, bruise my jaw or something like that. But anger damages my character. It penetrates to the very core of my being, especially if it becomes a habit. It might make me do crazy, stupid things in the future. It clouds my judgment, causes a kind of temporary insanity. He can't damage my judgment, but I can if I allow myself to go along with my anger and indulge in it. I can give way to these biases. So Seneca would say, rehearse it, notice what's going on, and notice how your beliefs and thoughts and values are interacting with your emotions in that situation, and allow yourself to get used to seeing it that way, so that next time when somebody catches you by surprise like that, you've rehearsed it and prepared for it in advance.
Okay. So anger by taking a distance and realizing you're angry, anxiety by exposure to anxious elements and visualizations when those elements are not there. What other emotions, what other examples, or what other negative emotions
Well, the big
can we
three
talk about?
are anger, fear, and sadness.
Anger, fear, and sadness.
Basically. Yeah, and they take different forms, but those are the broad categories that we use.
What do you do with sadness?
Well,
let's say your dog dies, or worse, family member dies, or something terrible happens.
Well, pathological sadness is clinical depression, basically, you could say. And clinical depression, I will admit, is a tougher nut to crack. Cognitive therapy, in a sense, evolved as a treatment for depression, but it's one of the success rates for clinical depression are more like around about 50%. Anxiety,
just 50%.
Yeah, it's hard to treat depression. Anxiety disorders have a much higher success rate because there isn't really an equivalent to exposure therapy. Like, exposure therapy is our gold standard for treating anxiety. Like, we have a 90% success rate with specific phobia, and then the PTSD, OCD, these other versions.
Is anxiety a form of fear? Can we categorize it as?
Basically. I mean, you can say that fear is a little bit more of a cognitive concept, but they're essentially closely related. They're interchangeable concepts. But depression is a tougher nut to crack. It's more cognitive, arguably. We don't have a great treatment. One of the most successful treatments that we have is actually a form of behavior therapy now called behavioral activation. And funnily enough, it's very similar to Stoicism, like glaringly similar. So it used to be believed. Actually, I'll tell you the whole story that therapists will usually go on about. When Aaron T. Beck introduced the first treatment manual for clinical depression in 1979, if I remember rightly, cognitive therapy for depression. So this is a watershed moment in history of psychotherapy, right? He combined cognitive therapy with a form of behavior therapy called activity scheduling. And only recently, researchers, about 10 years ago, something like that, researchers started doing what they call dismantling studies, where they took apart the elements of cognitive therapy for depression and tested them separately. And what they found, annoyingly, was that, what we'll do is we identify clients' negative thoughts and help them to question those rationally. We dig deep and identify the underlying...
Does it happen that somebody comes to you and says, I don't have any negative thoughts, it's just how I feel? Can you always identify negative thoughts?
Yeah, basically. They're kind of pre-conscious, so they're very fleeting, so people often aren't aware of them. But usually the first stage in therapy is a kind of awareness training where you get people to keep records and become more observant of their automatic thoughts. But even if they didn't identify specific thoughts that flash through their mind, and usually people can just by paying more attention, they can infer the underlying beliefs that they have. So we also have beliefs that might be unspoken. Yeah, I might believe that other people have to show me respect. It doesn't mean that I have to go around all the time in my head saying, people must respect me, people must respect me, people must respect me. It might just be implicit in the way that I act. It's an attitude that I have. So we can target those underlying beliefs. So 2 parts of cognitive therapy. Identify the specific negative automatic thoughts. So that's the stuff that you actually say to yourself in your head, and challenge some of those. But then also dig down and try and identify the underlying attitudes. Usually in depression, the core is believed to be negative labels that we attach to ourselves, like I'm worthless, I'm an idiot, I'm unlovable, and stuff like that. Like these broad labels we attach to ourselves. And the other part of therapy, cognitive therapy, is changing behavior. Because depressed people usually become quite withdrawn. So therapists would get depression.
Yeah.
So the other part of the treatment is that we get people to change their behavior by listing. It used to be that they would list activities that gave them a sense of mastery or achievement, and
Control.
activities that gave them a sense of pleasure. So if I get someone to brainstorm all the things that they normally find enjoyable or pleasurable in life, who's depressed, on a flip chart, let's say, and then I say to them, hey, so over the last couple of weeks, how many of those things have you done? Often they'll say, none of them. And I'll say, if I made a list of all the things that I find most enjoyable in life, and then I abandoned doing all of them, I guess I might start to feel kind of low after a while, like, and empty, right? So there's a circularity to depression, because people will say that because they feel depressed, they abandon going to the theatre and socialising and doing stuff that they used to enjoy. But obviously, abandoning those things contributes
to depression. Yeah.
It used to believe that pleasurable activities. It used to be believed that pleasurable activities were like an obvious part, but the focus has shifted more recently onto meaningful activities. So we usually get clients now in behavioral activation, which is the modern version of this, to identify their core values. So, what you really value is being a good father, or being creative, or being a great leader or something. Brainstorming tasks that would be consistent with those values. So you can look in the mirror and you have a sense that you're actually doing stuff that's fulfilling and meaningful at a deeper level. That seems to work better as a treatment for depression. It's not perfect, but it's one of the best treatments that we have at the moment. It's one of the most empirically supported treatments.
So go out there and do stuff.
Yeah, but based on your core values. And that's what we found, what researchers found, is that doing that on its own was as effective as traditional cognitive therapy. So challenging the beliefs and the automatic thoughts wasn't even used in that approach. It was almost completely focused on behavior change, and yet it was about as effective, but it's much simpler and it works a little bit more quickly.
Got it.
But the Stoics also want us to identify the virtues and to live more consistently in accord with them. So actually at the core of this approach, there's a philosophical distinction between two different types of value. So the client has to, this is a very simple approach.
Let's get into that. That's what I wanted to get into, yeah.
It's a very simple approach, but the client has to wrap their head around this concept at the beginning, which is you can either in life say that your goal is to make $1 million, or get 1 million followers, or pass an exam, or something like that, some external outcome or result in the future that you're hoping to attain. Now, the problem with external goals is it's like you're sending a message to your brain that said, there's something lacking now. What I've got at the moment isn't good enough. I've only got $500,000. That's not good enough. But one day, when I get $1 million, then I'm allowed to be happy. So you kind of defer your happiness to a point in the future, and it might be that you get $999,000, and then you're hit by a bus.
Okay, virtues, two sets, external, internal. No.
Yeah. Well, we have these external goals. So sometimes we say there are extrinsic values and intrinsic values. There's different terminology that's used.
Rewards.
Yeah. External outcomes, like goals, like passing an exam, making $1 million. So you could get hit by a bus before you pass your exam. And then would it mean that your whole life up to that point had been worthless? Because all of your self-esteem, all your value was invested in achieving something you never actually achieved. And the other thing is that when you achieve those goals, so you make $1 million, maybe you feel amazing, right? Your self-esteem goes through the roof for like a day. And then the next day you wake up and you know what you think. I'll be happy when I make 2 million.
Mm-hmm.
So you start often pursuing more goals, more distant goals. Like, so even when you achieve the goal, it maybe only gives you satisfaction briefly. You pass your degree and then you're like, "Way, I got a first. That's amazing." And you think, now I need to do a master's degree.
Right.
Now I need to do a PhD to be happy, right? So this whole way of assigning value to your life is in stark contrast to another approach that values character traits. So I might say, what I really value is self-discipline, integrity, and creativity. Okay, so I'm going to start exhibiting more creativity. I'll sit down and start writing a poem. It doesn't matter whether it's any good or not. Like, I had to go at doing it, I put some effort into it. When people do that, they usually experience some gratification immediately. How weird is that? So if I say I'll be happy when I get $1 million, I'll be happy 5 years from now, or maybe I'll never be happy. But if I say what I really value is self-discipline, and I begin changing my behavior right now, I'm instantiating that value immediately. So suppose I get hit by a bus. I might say, yeah, but I was exhibiting self-discipline every day until I got hit by a bus. So, I was doing something that made my life meaningful. So the shift to what's basically a virtue ethic, this is a fundamental to almost all branches of ancient philosophy, embraced some form of virtue ethic. Now, this idea is central to modern behavior therapy, actually, particularly behavioral activation for depression. And research shows...
What is virtue ethics?
It's when you place your values are primarily about character traits, basically.
Can you claim me top character?
Can we list some examples?
Yeah, can you list me examples?
There's the classic formula is wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, are what we call the cardinal virtues of Greek philosophy. Wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance.
Okay.
Those are the 4 cardinal virtues. So earlier I said the Stoics believe that we're intrinsically rational beings, and so we have an obligation to use reason consistently to the best of our ability. Then we would be wise. If we apply that wisdom to our social relationships, that's justice. But in order to live consistently in accord with wisdom and justice, we'll have to deal with fear and desire, because our fears might derail us, make us inconsistent.
Let me write those down. You said wisdom,
justice, courage,
and temperance.
Temperance is like moderation or self-discipline.
Okay.
Right? Now, actually, modern research on values...
These are cardinal virtues?
Yeah. Shows that, most of the values that people will say that they place importance on fall into those categories, or there's a handful of... Some people value things like creativity or spirituality or whatever. But those broad categories are still central to the way that people typically conceptualize their values.
Would you put creativity in those?
I don't think creativity is a virtue. Yeah, because you could be a creative serial killer. It could be creative at genocide. I think creativity is an asset, but it depends whether or not it's intrinsically valuable. It depends on the use that you make of it, whether or not it's really valuable. You could do terrible things creatively.
Can we define each one of those in a sentence?
Yeah.
Is that okay to ask?
Well, the way the Stoics define them is that they say wisdom is knowing the nature of the good. So in plain English, you might say, if I was talking to a child, as I often do, and ask them, I like to ask children, what's wisdom?
What's good?
Yeah, I ask them, what is wisdom? And I might ask them, which of the characters in this movie exhibit wisdom? And which ones seem unwise or foolish? I would say, because they'll say, well, how would you define wisdom? And I'd say, I think wisdom is knowing which things are genuinely important in life, and that has something associated with it, which is realizing that the things that most people believe are important aren't as important as they seem to think they are. So like wealth and reputation. So realizing that those things aren't as important as people think.
Reputation is pretty important, though, but it's external.
It's not intrinsically important, though. You know, the status and reputation that you have, I think, is only important or value. It's only value, but it's important in the sense that it's useful. It's an advantage in life, as is wealth, property. But it only contributes to a good life if you use it well. I'll give you an example. Right?
I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A social media influencer might have like a great reputation. A celebrity has reputation, but that might just allow them to do loads of narcissistic and stupid and self-indulgent things. Right?
I got what you mean.
So wisdom is knowing what's what's good.
What's important.
It's understanding your values.
What's good.
Yeah. So there's a kind of circularity to this. The most important value is understanding values, right? Which makes sense, right? Like, you know, it makes sense that there'd be a circularity to it. Justice is applying that consistently to your relationships with other people. So wanting to share wisdom with other people, you know, helping to educate people, realizing that the things that other people value aren't necessarily the most important things. Not arguing with other people so much about reputation and wealth and things like that, you know, but placing more emphasis on sharing wisdom with them, for instance. And then the other two, you know,
courage.
If you have fear and cravings, those are going to lead you astray. So you're going to have to, if you want to consistently act with wisdom and justice, you're going to need courage and self-discipline. So courage is the ability to face your fears. So it's knowing what it's appropriate to fear and what it's not appropriate to fear, and, you know, appraising threats accurately. And self-discipline or temperance is the ability to master your desires and to
be in control.
Yeah, be able to understand what is appropriate to desire and what it's not appropriate to desire, basically. But the core in Greek philosophy is wisdom. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. So the clue is in the name, buddy. Like the Stoic philosophers love wisdom. They value wisdom as the supreme virtue, basically. So that means that Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, for example, on almost every other page, he's saying to himself, keep bringing your focus back to the true goal of life, which is the pursuit of wisdom, you know, and the improvement of your character through the attainment of wisdom, a kind of moral wisdom, a sort of practical wisdom. You know, it's not wisdom in the sense, you know, of knowing a load of useless information. The Stoics and Socrates are pretty clear about that. Certain types of knowledge are more valuable than others. You know, the type of wisdom that would be really valuable would be the type of wisdom that would help you to live your life in a more fulfilling and more meaningful way. So like understanding what's genuinely important in life and seeing through other people's misconceptions, your own biases and so on. So Marcus keeps telling himself, at one point he says, of any action or even any thought, ask yourself, is this strictly necessary? And he says, by necessary, I mean, does it contribute to the fundamental goal of life? So of anything that you're doing, say to yourself, the Dalai Lama says something a bit like that. He says a Tibetan Buddhist, he says, should ask themselves of any thought or action, does this actually contribute to my long-term happiness and fulfillment, or does it do the opposite? Would getting in a fight with a random dude in the street contribute to my long-term happiness and fulfillment, or would it potentially do the complete opposite? So often the answer is kind of self-evident, right?
So one of the goals of Stoicism is the improvement of your character. Can you say that like mastering these 4 categories of values is one way to get to that? Are there any other very important virtues that are not cardinal?
Those are the cardinal virtues are supposed to be broad categories that encompass many dozens and dozens of sub-virtues. So unfortunately, the meaning is a little bit obscured by translation. So the Stoics believed that courage, for example, encompasses endurance, like enduring fatigue and things like that, as well as facing fears. The worst one is the word for justice, which in Greek, dikaiosune, means also, the Stoics say it also encompasses kindness or compassion. So we would say, well, what's missing? There's no reference to kindness or compassion. But for the Stoics, there was, because they believed that that was part of justice.
Compassion.
They say there are two elements to dikaiosyne, or social virtue, you could call it, would maybe be a better way to phrase it. So they say social virtue mainly consists of fairness and kindness. And those can be broken
You're
down
talking about
further.
justice here.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we usually think of justice as just being about fairness.
Legal. Yeah.
Like, we don't think of it as being compassionate or kind, trying to help other people. But the Stoics absolutely did think of it in that way. So yeah, like the translation kind of obscures that sometimes, but compassion would be in there as well. And the idea is it's just a kind of rough template that the Stoics actually think, like Socrates, that another way of understanding virtue is that it's consistent, it's rational. So in some ways, I always think it's easier. People often say they're confused about their values, and it's difficult to, who do I turn to for guidance in the world? There's so many conflicting values and stuff like that. But I think Socrates saw that that's kind of an illusion. It's a red herring. Because the first thing that we need to address is glaring inconsistencies in our values. Not the only thing, but usually we're all hypocrites. We say one thing and do another. And Socrates' method is designed to resolve contradictions. So, for example, I'll give you an example. He speaks to a young man.
Be practical.
He says, a young guy comes to him called Critobulus. He's the son of Socrates' best friend. And he's like about 15. And he says, I want you to introduce me to lots of influential people. I want you to introduce me to people who would make good friends in Athenian society. And Socrates says, sure. How do you define a good friend? So he always asks an easy question, right? And Critobulus is like, well, they'd lend you money. They'd come and visit you when you're sick. They'd go to the theatre with you. Maybe they'd even challenge you if they saw you doing something that was kind of inappropriate. Like, they wanted to pull you aside and have a word with you about your behaviour even. That kind of thing. And Socrates said, that's good. That's a fair definition of what makes a good friend. He said, how many of those qualities do you possess yourself? And Critobulus is like, well, not many of them. And so Socrates says, don't you think you've got this whole thing back to front? So you asked me to introduce you to people like that, right? But if I did that and you don't possess those qualities yourself, then I'd be misleading them. And eventually they'd figure that out and they'd become annoyed with you. And they'd also no longer trust me as a matchmaker of friends. What you should have asked me is how you could become a good friend yourself. Because if you develop those qualities, everyone would want to introduce you to good people and you'd make friends with them more easily. But you're focused too much on appearances. Socrates used to say you should be in reality as you wish to appear. Yeah. But there's something about our culture that causes us to become distracted by appearances over and over again, misled by them, and also to focus on pursuing appearances rather than the real deal. We want to look confident. We want to look intelligent. So looking intelligent is more important than being intelligent if we're not, if we're not careful. And Socrates is like, whoa, take a step back. Being intelligent is more important than looking intelligent. Being a good friend would be more important than appearing to be a good friend. Yeah. And so he says this is a hypocrisy. It's a moral contradiction. It's what we call today in therapy a double standard. You're applying a different standard to other people than you had been applying to yourself. And so resolving that contradiction actually leads to a heuristic that's very famous in the history of ethics. And it's very simple, and it occurs in many different religions and philosophy, but we find it in Socrates and find it in the Stoics.
Which one?
It's called the Golden Rule. It says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yeah. So don't be a hypocrite, basically. It's almost universal that we all agree that, everybody hates hypocrites, right?
I just say that's like the most important, the most universally accepted of all Virtues? Would you
Yeah,
call that a virtue? Yeah.
it's a rough guide, right? But it's funny that people say, "Oh, I'm confused about my values and I don't really know." And I think from the Socratic perspective, it's not confusing. You already there's things that you hate about other people. Even someone that's got no idea what what their values are, will usually be able to tell you things that they can't stand about other people. Usually politicians, right? So most people will say, "I can't stand these politicians. They're all liars and they're corrupt." Well, that suggests that you value honesty and integrity.
What's the difference between a virtue and a value?
Well, a value is a broader term, right? So you might place value on external goals. But something like there's a particular type of values that we're most interested in, usually in therapy, are the character-based values that are basically what the Stoics call the virtues, or the Greek philosophers call the virtues.
Virtue is like a characteristic of a behavior or a person.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, it's a quality of your behavior. It's a character trait.
So if somebody would like to get educated in those cardinal virtues, what do you think are the best documents besides meditations?
Well,
let's say somebody is listening to us. Where should he go, or where should she go from here on? What would be like the best readings?
The best things to read? Well, Ryan Holiday actually has a series of books that are based around each of the cardinal virtues in turn.
Okay.
There's that. But I mean, what I'm thinking is there's a better way than reading books. We come back to the Socratic method. So Socrates would say, you need to define what you think justice is and then begin to question it. Because a book is not going to give you an understanding of justice. What will give you an understanding of justice, a courage, is reflecting on it, like noticing exceptions to your assumptions about it, chewing it over and digesting the concept more deeply, thinking of exceptions to the way that you would normally define it. It's engage in talking to people about it, discussing it with other people. That's what you could, I guess today we would say, to really get to develop a real understanding of the virtues or your values. You could say your core values comes from reflecting on them and discussing them more than from reading a book. I think books are useful, but they're kind of like a starting point. You'll get generally quite a superficial understanding of values by doing that. I mean, what we normally do is get people to reflect on their values, think about examples of people they know that exhibit, say, justice, right? Who do you know that you think exemplifies that quality? Are there historical characters that you think are just or unjust? Are there fictional characters?
So who would be like a great historical character that embodies justice besides King Arthur or Solomon?
Well, those might be good examples.
Let's say somebody somebody alive.
Well, if you're asking me personally,
yeah, I'm asking personally. Yeah.
I would tend to think more of individuals that I've known in life rather than fictional historical characters. Some people would look at those. The reason I'm hesitant to do that is that I think people will interpret those characters differently. So if I say, yeah,
come on, you must be having some positive role models.
Yeah, but not
they're alive. No, they're not fictional and alive. Come on.
Well, let me tell you, right?
Yeah.
I've been asked this question many times. So people say, who are your role models in life? Who would you point to as an example of Stoic virtue and stuff like that? And I think they want me to say Nelson Mandela or Barack Obama or somebody famous. And what I would say about them is Socrates used to say, people would ask him, do you think the king of Persia is happy? And Socrates would say, I don't know, because I've never met the guy. Right? They would say he's the richest man in the world.
But do you think there are people right now in the public eye who are exuding these characteristics? Who do you think are important? Who are playing the role in our culture?
Only I think we can only really appraise that in a relatively superficial way, right? Because we can't really see into people's hearts, particularly from a distance through the lens of the media.
You're avoiding the question.
No, I'm deadly serious. I'm deadly serious.
Okay.
And also we have to be a little bit careful of bias. So there'll be people who view Donald Trump as exemplifying virtue. I know there are. I don't particularly see that, but they view him through a very different lens from me and interpret his motives very differently, right? You know, I think he might do things for one reason. They think he's doing it for a completely different reason because he's a patriot, right, and things like that. You know, if you're a leftist, you're going to find that highly questionable. It's going to be hard for you to imagine. But equally, people on the right can't understand what the hell is going on with leftists. They think Barack Obama and Biden are greedy, corrupt, and they can cite lots of evidence to support that. So I might form an opinion about it, but I have to also be aware that you could interpret their behaviour differently. You know, there's evidence that you could focus on one side, and evidence that you could focus on the other side. So that doesn't mean that I'm suspending judgment completely, but it does mean that I have some reservations about judging somebody's character from a distance. I might say, be like, also, I feel the same way about many
But
political...
Don't you think that's worrisome? We cannot identify... Because I've been thinking since I asked you the question. I don't know if I can find anybody.
Oh, that doesn't...
We're relying on mythological or ancient role models.
No, because what I was going to say is the people who come closest to serving as a role model for me are people that I've known personally. Now, when I was a young guy, I started doing therapy really early on, right? People often don't ask me about that, but if you ask me about my life, I would say one of the things that kind of characterizes it, I started doing therapy when I was in my early 20s, counseling and stuff. I worked in, it's difficult to be a therapist when you're young, if your clients are like 60, but I worked with teenagers. I was a schools counselor for like a year or two in high schools, and I worked for a drugs project. And if I think back to those times, some of the people that I feel were role models and exhibited most virtue were recovering drug addicts or recovering alcoholics, or sometimes also people who had self-time in prison. They kind of seemed more authentic to me. When they'd managed to actually turn their life around, right? I think it's like a wake-up call to people. So those would be anonymous individuals. They're not celebrities. They're not great politicians. I find it very difficult to treat politicians and celebrities as role models because I think we see them through the lens of the media, and I don't feel that I know what's really going on in their heart. I don't know what's going on in anyone's heart, but I think the closest that I get is just people that I've met over the years that I knew personally that seemed very down to earth and authentic to me and exhibit integrity, self-discipline, wisdom in their behavior.
Got it. Okay. So can we get to this guy, Marcus Aurelius? So why do you think Stoicism was such an important thing for him? And how did he contribute? I know he quoted a lot of other writers. What was his biggest contribution, I guess, to Stoicism?
Well,
and why is this book so important?
This might surprise you, but actually, ironically, his biggest contribution is his training in rhetoric, in a sense. Marcus Aurelius had many, many tutors. His mother was a highly educated and very wealthy woman. Her husband died probably when she was like 19 or something, and she never remarried. She was a construction magnate. She owned a tile factory and clay fields. She was a very wealthy and powerful woman, and she came from a highly educated family. She spoke fluent Greek, right? So she surrounded herself with a circle of intellectuals, and Marcus Aurelius had many tutors. And his two favourite tutors were Marcus Cornelius Fronto and Junius Rusticus. And they were kind of rivals. So Fronto was his rhetoric tutor, and Junius Rusticus was his Stoic tutor. And Fronto, we see in their letters, we have the correspondence between them, says to Marcus repeatedly, philosophy is going to give you insight, into paradoxical arguments and concepts. But rhetoric is going to teach you how to put them into words and articulate them clearly. And you need both. They complement each other. And so this was his argument for Marcus continuing to study rhetoric. And he says to him to take philosophical concepts and turn them over in your mind and paraphrase them repeatedly until you find exactly the right words to express your meaning. And ironically, that's what we see him doing in the meditations. He's doing the very thing that Fronto told him to do. So his rhetoric teacher told him to do this exercise. In the meditations, he repeats himself over and over again. He's just paraphrasing ideas that he's learned from Stoic philosophers. But the reason that we're still reading it today is that Marcus Aurelius was an intelligent guy. He was a massive nerd. He started studying rhetoric and philosophy when he was about 12 years old, which was unusually young, even for a Roman aristocrat. And he carried on studying philosophy and rhetoric until the day he died, which was also unusual in the Roman Empire or in the ancient world in general. People made fun of him for going to attend lectures when he was in his 50s. They thought it was something that only young people should do. It'd be like he's attending a university lecture and the rest of the room are all kids in their 20s. And people are like, this is crazy. Like, you know, the rule of the Romans is going to college.
Yeah.
So that's what they said about him. But the reason that we're still reading him today is some people have said that the Meditations doesn't show a great deal of rhetorical ability. But I think those people are wrong. I believe that Marcus Aurelius is clearly a highly trained, highly experienced, naturally talented rhetorician. And I think he's particularly good at writing aphorisms. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. People quote Marcus Aurelius left, right, and centre. They still are quoting him nearly 2,000 years after he was alive because he writes really memorable and vivid aphorisms.
That's true.
Right? Of course, he's a good writer.
Like really, really well. I don't know if it's a translation or the original text is like very readable, but it's really easy to consume.
Fronto says something really weird to him that always struck me. So Fronto's the most acclaimed Latin rhetorician in the world at the time. And rhetoric was a highly sophisticated, highly structured discipline. You know, people spent their lives training in it. It was much more systematic than we would assume today. I mean, an ancient Greek or Roman who's trained in rhetoric would, in a sense, like, you know, blow our minds. They have much more sophisticated understanding of how to construct and deliver speeches, for example, and I think we would today. They had a lot of practice. We can see Marcus training over and over again, practicing writing things. So he knew what he was doing. Fronto, rather than saying the essence of rhetoric is all these different strategies and techniques that you can potentially learn, he says the secret of rhetoric is something quite simple, but very difficult to do. It's fascinating. He says the secret of rhetoric is to take an unusual word and use it in the place of a more common word. But to pick a word that really serves the meaning that you want to convey better than the common word that it's replacing.
Be precise. Be precise in a way.
Yeah, to be more precise,
specific,
to use language that's more evocative.
Accurate.
Yeah, but that's the way that he chooses to express it. And he says in order to do that, you have to have a rich vocabulary. You have to have studied extensively in literature and poetry, and your mind has to be like a treasure house of images, figures of speech, interesting words. You know, you maybe have 101 different metaphors, like to describe snow or something like that, right? There's a Kate Bush song called 50 Words for Snow, where she just uses all these different phrases and kind of like, it's Stephen Fry, I think, that repeats them, that does the vocals in it. It's just like all these different little phrases to describe the same thing. So Fronto says you've got to pick the right words, pick the right image, to really capture your meaning better than the ordinary way. And he says if you overuse this, it's going to sound artificial. So you should use it judiciously and selectively. I saw a writer in a newspaper in the UK describe a kind of creepy British politician by saying that he had a smile like a glint of winter sunshine on a coffin lid. Now, that's a very powerful and evocative...
Go again, repeat it.
He had a smile that was like a glint of winter sunshine on a coffin lid. Right? That's how he described that guy. You think, wow, that's like really specific, really evocative. That's better than just saying he had a creepy smile.
Yeah.
Right? That's what frontal meant. You've got to get exactly the right image that really conveys your meaning. And you see Marcus trying to do that with his philosophy in the Meditations, and that's why, people get it tattooed on them. And they're still reading, even in translation. He's often using quite powerful and evocative images to express himself. So I think that's partly why it's lasted throughout the ages. And he focuses on the practical side.
He's a master of language, very colorful.
Only about 1%, less than 1% of Stoic writings survive today.
Yeah.
Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote 700 books, we're told. Probably like essays, actually, right? But none of them survive today. We know of about 60 or 70 famous Stoics, teachers, writers in the ancient world. We only really have substantial writings from 3 of them today: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. There is other stuff, but like
Seneca was not. Is Seneca considered as a Stoic writer? Yeah. He is, eh?
Yeah. But we also have a lot from Cicero, who's this famous Roman statesman, politician. He's not a Stoic, but he had studied Stoicism. He was a highly educated man, and he writes extensively about Stoicism. So he's actually one of our major sources, but people often kind of overlook him because he was a Platonist rather than a Stoic, but very interested and very influenced by Stoicism. There's other stuff as well that we have, but I suspect that a lot of the Stoic writings don't survive because they were boring. And Seneca was a great writer. Marcus Aurelius was a highly trained rhetorician. And Epictetus is the kind of odd one out, except for the following fact. Epictetus never wrote anything. He had a student called Arrian, who was a very senior Roman statesman in general, who wrote the Discourses and the Handbook of Enchiridion. And Arrian was a highly educated man, extensively trained in rhetoric, and a very experienced writer. So again, very talented writer, deceptively simple, the language that Epictetus uses in Greek. The language he uses is far simpler. His vocabulary is much smaller than the vocabulary that Marcus Aurelius uses. But Arrian, the guy that was writing it down, was a very talented and experienced writer. So I think these books survive because they're memorable, because they're evocative, because they're beautifully written. And, I suspect that a lot of the other Stoic texts, if we were to read them today, not all of them, but I think many of them would seem quite dry by comparison. We have some fragments from other authors. There's a chunk of a book by a guy called Hierocles, who's probably a contemporary of Marcus Aurelius. It's pretty boring by comparison. No offense, Hierocles, but it's not quite the same. It's more theoretical. I'll tell you, here's a bit of trivia for you. Fronto says something quite surprising to Marcus Aurelius. He says a number of little odd things. In the letters, he says he makes fun of Marcus's the philosophy lectures he's attending. He says that they're really boring. They focus on logic. There's no homework assignments that they're supposed to do between sessions. And most of the time, the students are just sitting there, daydreaming and gazing out of the window. And he says rhetoric is a much more practical training because you're actually supposed to give speeches and write essays and speeches. You do homework more extensively in rhetoric. Seems like a kind of surprising thing to say. Doubly so because we think of Stoicism as an applied philosophy. But I wonder whether some of the Stoic teachers prior to that, but during Marcus's lifetime as well, were theoreticians, were teaching in a more dry and academic style. And maybe one of the reasons that Epictetus became so famous in the ancient world, I mean, he's the only real example we have of a Stoic teacher, but maybe he was really unusual. It might be that people were like, his approach is much more like therapy, whereas these guys are like teaching logic and stuff like that, and it's become a bit abstract. So maybe, we think of Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius is following Epictetus. We have the discourses of Epictetus. That might not have been representative of what a lot of Stoicism looked like. Maybe a lot of it was more scholarly and dry. We have Seneca, and his writings seem quite applied, but not quite in the way that Epictetus is. Epictetus, as is often the case in the history of philosophy, he's an old school approach. He's clearly returning back to the early days of Stoicism, and he's returning back to something that's more like the Socratic method. We see him using the Socratic method, and we have transcripts. Arian wrote down transcripts of his discussions with students, so we can actually see him engaging in the Socratic method, and he uses it therapeutically. He's talking to a guy who's a senior Roman official who said that his young daughter was dying. Sounds like he implies that she had a tumour that had to be operated on, and he thought she was going to die, I think, following surgery. So he ran away and abandoned her bedside because it was freaking her out too much. And Epictetus questions him about whether this was natural and whether this was a virtuous response. And actually, one of the things he says is, if you were dying, would you want your daughter and your wife and your servants to abandon you and leave you to die on your own? And he says, well, obviously not. And Epictetus basically says, well, isn't that a double standard then? Like, it seems like, you thought, I can't handle this, I love my daughter so much, and you ran away. If people ran away from you, would you think that that's an expression of how much they love you? Or if they really loved you, wouldn't they stay with you? Yeah. So again, he's just, in the same way as with Critobulus, when Socrates was questioning him about his double standard relating to friendship, here we see Epictetus, like 500 years later, doing the Socratic method in a very similar way, and in a way that's clearly therapeutic. He's kind of, in a sense, he's challenging catastrophizing, and on the part of this guy in low frustration tolerance. The guy's like, I can't bear this, but maybe he's underestimating his ability to cope.
I heard you saying that most of self-help systems or books do not help very much.
Self-evidently,
right? Yeah.
Well, we'd all be cured by now, right?
right.
Where are all these people that have been helped?
Right. So you go to somebody's house and there's like a whole wall of self-help books,
and you
right?
think, wow, you must be enlightened, dude. And
they still have.
I don't know if you've noticed this. The people that have the most self-help books are the most neurotic people, self-help junkies.
Right.
There are reasons for that. We consume vastly more self-help and self-improvement content than previous generations did. I said to you earlier,
isn't that a good thing? It doesn't mean we're like open to it.
It would be good if it worked.
Right. So is Stoicism a self-help system?
In a sense, it is. It's an ancient self-help system.
So how is it different?
I think it's a better system.
First of all, do you think it works?
Yeah, I do think it works.
Why? Why does it work and the other ones are not?
Well, I'll answer first of all empirically what evidence is there that it works.
Sure, yeah.
The scientific research now emerging on Stoicism, incidentally, that validates some of the concepts and techniques. But up until now, most of the research had been indirect, and it had been that cognitive...
Can you check that? What was it?
Yeah.
There is evidence for Stoicism working better than other self-help models?
I didn't say it worked better. I said we have evidence that it works.
That it works.
Yeah. There are pilot studies from... Tim LeBon is the research director of the Modern Stoicism non-profit organization. Okay. So he compiles...
In 2021, a study and its results showed a significant drop in negative thinking among people with strong tendency to worry.
There are a number of emerging studies on Stoicism.
Okay.
And there's indirect evidence from cognitive therapy. The cognitive therapy works, and it's based on similar principles.
Yeah,
to
I'll give you
Stoicism.
the benefit of the doubt. It works.
Yeah.
Why do you think it works?
Why do I think it works? Because it's based on the Socratic method, right? It doesn't give people an overly formulaic solution. There are formulas and pieces of advice in Stoicism, but it encourages...
Since you got here, I've been trying to get a formula
Uh-huh.
out of you, and I couldn't get it. And the closest we came was those cardinal values.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy we got that.
Oh, okay. I mean, the Stoics do have formulaic pieces of advice, but it's a philosophical system, right? They want us to question our assumptions and think for ourselves. So the way I would think of it is the self-help techniques are like the stabilizers on a bicycle, right? They can be useful, but we shouldn't become overly dependent on them. The most famous Stoic technique is there are many, but one of them, so the Socratic method is a technique, but the view from above is a well-known visualization technique. Marcus talks about it about like half a dozen times or so towards the end of the meditations, but you can find it in many other ancient texts. The view from above just consists in visualizing things as if you're looking down, like
a drone.
Yeah, basically. And there's some people are doing research on that at the moment. There's some interest among psychologists in testing it because it has face validity. Clearly, if you visualize things from a broader perspective and also a wider chronological perspective, it clearly does something. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but that's more than you could say for a lot of psychological techniques, right? So it does something dramatic, psychologically. Clearly, it shifts your perspective dramatically. So, I mean, I don't know, like we might think it could help you, it could harm you, but it does something. Right?
It gives you
it makes it worth testing.
Right.
And actually, it looks like typically people say it increases their sense of equanimity. Now, there are other reasons why it has face validity. You could say it's like Zeus looking down from Mount Olympus, right? Taking a kind of elevated view of things. Also, in the ancient world, when they studied cosmology and tried to imagine the universe as a whole and theorize it, in a sense, they're doing a similar thing. They're contemplating themselves within a much wider context.
I have here learn to differentiate between internal, external desires and aversions. That's one. That's a big one. No? No?
Who wrote that?
Epictetus. No?
Does it learn to differentiate between...
internal and external desires and aversions. Eliminate desires for external rewards.
Okay. Yeah.
Did I?
That's what we were saying.
That? Yeah.
That's what we were saying earlier about the values, that he wants us to basically place more value on our character traits, on the virtues, rather than on external outcomes.
Train yourself to desire only improvement of agency. No.
Kind of. That's an odd way of phrasing it, but yeah, that's in a sense that's what he's saying.
Refine your logical skills. That's the rhetorics. That's kind of self-evident. Understand your duty in life.
It's a bit vague.
It's a bit vague. Well, what do you think those are? Like,
what do I think the techniques of Stoicism?
Yeah, like the bird view. What's the name for the bird view that you use?
The view from above.
The view from above, yes.
In the first book that I wrote, I tried to list as many as I could find, and I identified 18 distinct psychological strategies in Stoicism. So there are many. I guess if I was to pick a handful, contemplating your own death, contemplating the ideal sage, so imagining somebody who's completely wise and virtuous and how they would behave in different situations. Premeditatio malorum, so imagining misfortunes in advance in order to prepare yourself for them. Yeah, it's like exposure therapy. The Socratic method, cognitive distancing, they kind of do. So actually that quote from Epictetus that says it's not, people are upset not by things but by their judgments about them. Grasping the meaning of that would actually bring about cognitive distancing. So it's actually a psychological technique, like to contemplate that phrase. But Epictetus not only tells his students that in many different ways, he actually teaches them today we have like, I don't know, half a dozen or more specific techniques that we can teach clients in therapy that bring about this shift in perspective. Epictetus does several. So the other one that he does is he says to his students, whenever you have a troubling impression, so like whenever you feel angry or something like that, you have an automatic thought, let's screw this guy, like you're angry or whatever. He said, speak to it and say, you're just an appearance and not at all the thing that you claim to represent. So he's doing actually two techniques combined there. He's apostrophizing or talking to his thoughts, which forces you to shift towards a kind of more objective point of view on them, as if you're observing someone else's thoughts. So that's cognitive distancing. But he's also saying to himself, you're just an impression. You're just like a representation. So he's separating the thought from the thing that it refers to. So rather than saying, if I say to myself, hey, this guy's a total jerk, he's saying, no, I just have the impression that he's a jerk. That's a perspective that I'm looking at him from. You know, it's not an intrinsic quality. He's not intrinsically a jerk. That's just my way of interpreting his behavior, right? So those are two separate techniques, basically, but they're closely related. We can actually see him telling his students to do that. There's another technique that he describes, which is really important in modern therapy. It's called postponement. It's actually the technical term for it is the stimulus control method of managing worry. He says to his students, when you notice yourself becoming upset, postpone going along with your initial impression. So he says withhold assent from it, which again is like cognitive distancing. So just observe your anger, like notice that it's a feeling that you have, that you don't have to agree with it or indulge in it or go along with it, and postpone responding to it until you've calmed down, right? So that's actually one of the main techniques that we use for generalized anxiety disorder, but it's also used in the treatment of clinical depression now as well. So people, when they notice that they're starting to ruminate or worry, will often be told to suspend responding to it. Say, I'm going to come back to this later, and wait until the mood has changed, or a later time of the day, a time of their choosing, and sit down and more deliberately think through the thing that they were previously worrying or ruminating about.
Makes sense,
So these guys were way ahead of the curve. I mean, I say that, I don't say that lightly, because it makes me cringe when I say it. I think it sounds a little bit corny, but really, I'm not kidding. Like, the Stoics actually, in many regards, it genuinely, to this day, surprises me that they have these kind of insights. There might be reasons for that. We definitely seem to have lost sight of a lot of these ideas. I mean, I can emphasize that by saying, you might say, well, cognitive behavioral therapy arrived at similar conclusions. Yeah, but for the first half of the 20th century, everyone was doing psychoanalysis. Almost, like most people were. And that bears very little resemblance to what the Stoics were saying. So if you think that what Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus is saying is common sense or obvious, wasn't common sense to Freud or Jung or any of those guys or Melanie Klein or the rest of them, right? There's nothing like what they were doing. Ellis and Beck came along, suddenly it became validated again, became common sense. So it wasn't obvious to people.
Did they have access to Stoic writings?
Yeah.
Freud, and have they read it?
I don't know if they read.
Marcus Aurelius?
I'm not aware of whether they'd actually read them or not.
But you would think somebody like Jung, who was a brilliant mind, who went through the entire classics, he must have been aware of that, no? Has he commented on it?
I'm not aware of Jung commenting on the Stoics to the best of my knowledge. But Jung must have read other kind of adjacent stuff.
Yeah, you would think. Yeah.
For a start, the concept of the archetypes is taken from Neoplatonism. It's a Platonic idea. So he must have had some familiarity with Greek philosophy, but I don't know how much of it he'd actually read. There was another psychotherapist at the start of the 20th century called Paul Dubois, who was a Swiss psychiatrist. He was very famous. Proust was one of his clients, reputedly, and he was a rival of Freud. He had many followers, and he was...
What was his name?
Paul Dubois.
Paul Dubois.
And he was really into Stoicism. and he prescribed reading Seneca's letters to his patients. But then everyone forgot about him, and they were much more interested. Freud eclipsed him. So we had a go at Stoic psychotherapy that was pretty influential at the start of the 20th century, and then it disappeared for a while because it got eclipsed by Freudianism. Everyone became interested in that.
So he was just, okay. He was the fashionable thing to talk about. Okay, I think how are we doing on time?
It's 10 to 9.
10 to 9. Would you like to bring anything up? I don't know, like I have a feeling you know so much more than me. I don't know if I even ask you the proper questions.
No, these are all good questions.
I let you talk a lot. I was trying to
talk a lot.
Which is kind of what you're supposed to do. My job, what I thought my job was to try to extract some practical insights. And I think we did that partially.
I think we got some.
Well, I think we got a lot. Is there anything else you'd like to bring up? Like, what are you up to now? What do you think it's important right now, 2025?
Well, we talked earlier about anger. Like my main research area of interest at the moment is the philosophy and psychology of anger. I'm organising a conference that's coming up on that.
Really? When is it?
It's in the middle of March.
Okay. In Montreal?
No, it's a virtual conference.
Oh.
But we expect there to be about 1,500 people attending it. And we have some of the leading experts in philosophy and psychology.
Where can we find you? Substack?
My website is on Substack. My website is donaldrobertson.name. And, you know, I'm hopefully my next book is going to be about anger, because I think, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we're living in times that are quite divisive. Political rhetoric tends to fuel anger, right? It's bread and butter of demagogues to trade in fear and anger. And so social media amplifies that. Anger's everywhere. And there are many things that I think people should learn about the nature of anger, its implications, how to deal with it. The Stoics, we have an entire book by Seneca on anger, but Marcus Aurelius, I'll tell you a little anecdote about Marcus Aurelius, right? Maybe this is an interesting thing to leave people with. In Book 11 of the Meditations, chapter 18, Marcus Aurelius lists 10 distinct cognitive strategies for coping with anger, specifically. And not only does he give that list, but he returns to selections from it repeatedly throughout the Meditations. So that tells me that he knows that list by heart and he really understands it.
Can you name them?
No. From memory? I could have a go. I forget most of them. Gosh. He says that we should focus on our social nature, like we are designed by nature for collaboration with other people. He says that when you're becoming angry, you should recognize that you're also guilty of similar things yourself. He says that you should focus on the person's character as a whole rather than focusing narrowly on the thing that's making you angry about them. He says you should recognize that it's not the person that's making you angry, but your opinions about them, just as Epictetus said. He said that you should tell yourself that your anger does you more harm than the thing you're angry about, as I mentioned earlier. He says that you should remind yourself that it's transient, and before long both of you will be dead, so there's no point blowing it out of proportion. And he says, I think I've got like 7 or 8 of them. He said also that we should remind ourselves that it would be irrational of us to act as if other people are wise, basically. The Stoics think this is a mistake. We expect other people to be perfect.
But they're not.
Yeah, so when people make mistakes, when people are rude, when people are selfish, we kind of act shocked. The Stoics think this is weird. They think that our distress is amplified by the fact that we say, I can't believe this guy. Like,
yeah.
You know, why would anybody do that? Like, who would have ever thought somebody, like if I was like, that dude that punched me in the street, if I was like, I can't believe a dude just punched me in the street, like, what's that person does things like that, and I acted like I was like shocked and surprised and stuff like that, what would that achieve except just to make me even more like upset about it, right? But the reality is people get punched in the face every day, right? It's not been the first time, and it probably won't be the last time, right? It happens. He probably walked 10 minutes down the street and did it to somebody else. So, the Stoics want us to say people do weird stuff. Marcus, at the beginning of the Meditations, Marcus says, every morning when you wake up, tell yourself that you're going to meet meddling, tedious, treacherous, deceitful, greedy,
limited
individuals. Like, people are imperfect. And accepting that in advance makes you less prone to get neurotic about it. I mean, Albert Ellis basically extracted from Stoicism this idea that, and from his knowledge of psychotherapy, this is a very simplistic model, but actually I'll leave people with this as well. It's a really good heuristic, a good guide. So Ellis said, look, most people's problems are caused by rigid demands that they impose on themselves, other people, and life in general. So we go around acting as if other people have to respect us, right? And if they don't, we're going to get upset. It's almost like you have a little algorithm that says, you have to act the way that I want you to, otherwise I'm going to get angry or sad. I have to succeed at everything I do, otherwise I'm going to freak out and become anxious. Yeah, life has to be fair, otherwise I'm going to become depressed about it. Right? And so it's basically like just we're following a little formula that says I'm going to get upset
no matter what,
unless the standard's met.
Yeah.
But it's an unrealistic standard that's bound to be violated sometimes. So rather than rigidly demanding that other people behave in a certain way or that we meet a certain standard that life does, it would be better to accept in advance that I'm fallible. Like, there are dishonest people in the world. There are violent people in the world. Doesn't mean that I approve it or I excuse it. It's just, in a way, it's just a form of realism. So it's like, yeah, like there are people out there. I always remember an example of this was I worked in Harley Street for many years. I used to walk through Oxford Circus like 5 days a week. I'd see pickpockets every day hanging out in the tube station. I'd see them bumping into people where they're crossing at the traffic lights. And I remember vividly thinking to myself, eventually somebody's going to steal my wallet. I think I had my wallet stolen like twice, my mobile phone stolen once over the space of like 10 years or something. But when it happened, I was kind of more mentally prepared for it because I thought it's bound to happen eventually. Like, I've seen it happen to loads of other people. I'm not like, somehow magically protected from pickpockets. I might be a little bit more aware of them. But if you think these things happen, c'est la vie, basically, is the Stoic attitude. Or to put the same thing another way, they just say it's irrational to behave as if you're shocked and surprised by things that you can plainly see happen to other people every day of the week.
Be prepared.
Yeah.
Be prepared by the limitations of other people and the situations. Okay, so your conference is March, April?
Middle of March sometime,
Middle of March at your website and Substack. You have a pretty big Substack. Is there a book upcoming? Another upcoming book?
Yeah, I had 2 books that came out last year. Controversial, that's unusual. But the next book that I'm hoping to work on, still a fledgling idea, is a book about the philosophy and psychology of anger. And I have a lot of psychologists that I've made friends with and I'm collaborating with, and we're looking at possible research projects on Stoicism and anger.
Okay.
Here's a little tip for you. But again, one more little
last thing.
You want one
last
more
thing.
practical? Just one more thing.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys test this out for me, right? Because I did a little pilot study and we found about 40-50% reduction in subjective ratings of anger when I gave people a ridiculously simple instruction.
Which is what?
I just ripped it straight out of Marcus Aurelius, right? But it's an instruction that makes total sense to me in terms of behavioral psychology, by the way. I just told people when they think of something that makes them angry, just ask themselves what does you more harm, your anger or the thing that you're angry about, and really focus on that question. And there are a number of interesting reasons why simply posing that question might actually work and derail the anger. One is the way that it shifts your focus of attention would be antagonistic to anger escalating. But that's it. Like, what does you more harm, your anger or the thing that you're angry about? For many people, it seems to me, simply asking themselves that question and really focusing on it can diffuse anger in a rational way, though, and help them shift perspective on it. So that's an example of a Stoic technique that has kind of face validity, by which I mean it looks like it might work, although we still have to do extensive research on it.
Okay. Donald, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. We'll do it again.
Cool.
Good night, everybody.